And now, joining me from Melbourne, I've got Labor MP Kelvin Thomson, from Brisbane Liberal MP Steve Chobo. Gentlemen, good to see you both. Kelvin, first to you. On the polling and the start of the carbon tax, it's hard to know where to start, but it looks 33% support the policy. That's down 4%. 51% believe they're going to be worse off. As the tax comes into force, it must feel like you're fighting just a lost cause.
Well, first, Kieran, I'm very relieved to see you here and relieved to be here the morning after Wiped Off the Map Day. I'm here in the Herald Sun building and it's a hive of activity, and I drove in through the streets of Melbourne. You half expect to see them deserted given the shrill and hysterical campaign we've seen in the lead-up to the introduction of the carbon price, but in fact the traffic was very heavy, and I think we can be confident that the Australian economy will continue to motor on successfully. We've been doing much better than other countries around the world, and we've got every reason to be positive about our future, and I think it's time we had a little less of the doom and gloom. 300
companies and organisations, Steve Chobo, had a similar message to Kelvin Thomson in today's papers, releasing advertisements. Westpac, AGL, GE, some fairly big organisations saying that they support the carbon tax and the policy.
Oh, look, Kieran, there's no doubt that there are some people who do support the carbon tax. No doubt Julia Gillard does. It's just a shame she didn't tell us that ahead of the last federal election. But, Kieran, I think what's important to realise is, frankly, I think Calvin's comments are, in a word, idiotic. For the Labor Party to be out there making out that there's not a problem and overblowing what's actually being said, let's refer to who said wipe off the map, because the Labor Party is running this scare campaign that Tony Abbott used this phrase. The reality is the person who said wiped off the map in relation to Whyalla was Wayne Hanson, who's an AWU union leader, and he said that that carbon tax that Labor's introducing directly threatens 3,000 to 4,000 jobs in Whyalla. But more broadly, Kieran, the issue is this. Labor's carbon tax was brought in on a lie. It's going to raise $9 billion of additional tax. We know that there will be millions of Australian families worse off. And the most fundamental point of all is this is going to represent a massive increase in the cost of living for all Australians, with very few Australians benefiting from tax decreases. And the reality is that we're going to all this expense, we're making our country less competitive, and there will be no environmental benefit at all. In fact, our CO2 emissions will increase.
Okay, Kelvin, 42% of businesses put up their prices from yesterday. You've got to be keeping your fingers and toes crossed that the cost of living impact is as you've predicted, because there's a lot of uncertainty about it.
Of course, but as you're aware, the Treasury modelling is that the average impact will be $9.90 per household per week, and the assistance package will be $10 on average per household per week. So our belief is that the impact will be small, that it will be less than the GST, and that the elements of the compensation package which are coming into effect right now, so for example the tax-free threshold being trebled from $6,000 to $18,000 per annum, 1 million taxpayers now no longer having to pay any tax at all, that those benefits will be felt by households, and they'll start thinking, well, if Tony Abbott is going to take us back, if he's going to take the tax-free threshold back to $6,000 a year, then in fact we'll be worse off. Those people who are now able to go out and earn an income without paying tax will be worse off.
Steve Chobo, Simon Benson in the Telegraph today, in his exclusive, has some Treasury modelling. He says some of the country's top polluting companies will pay an effective carbon tax of only $1.30 a tonne. So the criticisms of the tax hampering trade-exposed industries, that is a bit overblown, isn't it? $1.30 a tonne would be one of the lowest prices in the world.
Kieran, it's not overblown. I mean, the Labor Party has legislated that it's $23 a tonne, but more importantly, the issue is this.
But with the compensation.
We know. Yeah, well, hang on, Kieran. We're talking about, and even Calvin just made this point, talking about so-called tax cuts and people won't be paying tax. They will be paying tax. They'll be paying the carbon tax every time they turn on a power switch. They'll be paying the carbon tax every time they walk into a small business and buy something, whether it's a container of milk or something like that, because the carbon tax is an economy-wide tax. So they might be making an income tax reduction, but make no mistake, they are paying more tax all the time. But the fundamental issue is this. The next federal election is going to be a referendum on carbon tax. That's what the next election will all be about. Whether people want to continue to pay the world's biggest carbon tax or whether they don't. And fundamentally, I think that Australians know one thing. The Labor Party can sit there and say, well, Treasury modelling says there's only going to be 20 cents difference between the amount of household compensation and the actual increase that households will have to pay. You know what Treasury modelling said last year, Kieran? It said that the deficit that the Labor Party introduced was going to be $22 billion deficit. You know what it actually ended up being? $44 billion. They were 100% incorrect.
Gents, we've got about 2 minutes left on the program, so I'd like to give you a minute each on this issue, asylum seekers policy. The poll today shows 9 out of 10 wanted a compromise. We didn't see it. Tony Abbott makes the fair point, doesn't he, Kelvin Thomson, that on carbon and on pokies, the Prime Minister said she had to deal with the Parliament she had. But on asylum seeker policy, it's a different story, not willing to reach that compromise.
Well, you're right, Kieran, that people do want us to fix this problem, to come up with a compromise. I went to the meeting organised by Tony Windsor and Mel Washer last week in the Parliament and frankly found it quite inspiring. More than 40 MPs looking to be parliamentarians rather than politicians. In the interests of coming up with a compromise, I indicated I was prepared to rethink my previous opposition to Nauru and to temporary protection visas. I wish the opposition and the Greens would rethink their position in relation to Malaysia. I think that parties should be prepared to look at what the panel chaired by Angus Houston comes up with and to say we will accept the findings of that panel. No one needs to lose political face here. We should agree in the interests of breaking this deadlock that we do need to come up with a compromise and that the present system simply is not working and is failing everybody.
Okay, Steve Chobo, to wrap up the program, your thoughts.
Sure.
And also the floating processing centre being suggested by Peter Van Onselen in the Australian newspaper today. Is that a realistic option from the coalition?
Well, look, I haven't seen what Peter Van Onselen has said, but on the issue about what transpired last week, you know, what we saw was a complete failure of national political leadership. We saw that Julia Gillard, unfortunately, wasn't prepared to move. The coalition put up amendments. We said that they could go to 148 countries for offshore processing. That's what we wanted. The only requirement was that they had to be UN signatories to the convention. Of course, the Labor Party turned their back on that. So, you know, it's unfortunate, Kieran, because what we continue to see now is, for the same reasons, there's been 20,000 asylum seekers since Labor was elected. That's going to continue. Instead, Julia Gillard says, let's go to another committee, let's get more input, and while we respect the committee members, the reality is what was required was firm leadership, a solution.
All right. Gentlemen, thank you for that. Incidentally, Peter Van Onselen's report in The Australian suggesting that's a coalition policy under consideration for an interim floating processing centre. That's in The Australian. That's by the way. Thank you both for your company this morning. Thank you for your company at home as well. We'll see you soon.